Well, good evening. One question we all in this life must ask ourselves is, are we washed in the blood of the Lamb? We're going to sing that hymn tonight as we begin. Let's stand together and sing, Are You Washed in the Blood? Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you walking daily by the Savior's side? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Do you rest each moment in the crucified? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? When the bridegroom cometh, will your robes be white? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Will your soul be ready for the mansions bright, and be washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? And lay aside the garments that are stained with sin, and be washed in the blood of the Lamb. There's a fountain flowing for the soul and clean. Will be washed in the blood of the Lamb. Are you washed in the blood, in the soul cleansing blood of the Lamb? Are your garments spotless? Are they white as snow? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? You may be seated.
All right, we are back to our study in Genesis this week, and we are in Genesis chapter 23. Genesis chapter 23. See, 2 weeks ago, when we were last in this study of Genesis, we had looked at the sacrifice of Isaac, or at least the Lord calling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. But of course, we know he wasn't. Rather, the Lord provided a ram. Well, today, as the story is beginning to transition away from Abraham, more onto Isaac and Rebekah, we find the story of Sarah's death and burial. So I'm going to begin by reading from Genesis chapter 23, and you can follow along as I do so. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold you from his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead." Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, "If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place." Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites of all who went in at the gate of the city, "No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you, the cave, in the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead." Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, "But if you will, hear me. I give the price of the field, accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there." Ephron answered Abraham, "My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field which the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Now, in reading and studying this was an interesting chapter to study because there's not a lot that really jumps off the page to you in regards to finding some spiritual principle in it that we can apply to our life, finding some grand teaching about the Lord himself, or even something that Abraham learned throughout all of this. It's just the story of a man trying to find a place to bury his wife. There's not a lot going on there. And in general, it's a chapter that we just quickly scan through as we're reading. Don't give it much thought. But as we do dig into it, I believe there is gold to be found here, especially as we see how Abraham responded to Sarah's death. And even as we'll look at Sarah, and some of the things the New Testament says about Sarah in her death, and how we can trust God, and how we can honor God and be faithful to God, even in the face of death, facing our own death and the death of others. The first thing that we find here is that we see Abraham and Sarah's love grew even as they faced trials. Abraham and Sarah's love grew even as they faced trials. So the story in Genesis is now transitioning from Abraham to Isaac. And it's not going to spend a ton of time on Isaac. It'll pretty quickly then transition on to Jacob and to his 12 sons. But we're in a transition going from Abraham to Isaac. And Sarah, it's been a while since we've seen anything from Sarah, but Sarah re-enters the story here as we learn of her death at the ripe old age of 127. And so Sarah dies, and it immediately says that Abraham begins to weep for her. Her body, as was the custom, was placed alone in a tent. And it's easy to just see that. Well, yeah, like his wife died. Of course he would weep. Like we don't think much about that. But we've learned a lot about Abraham throughout this story. We've seen Abraham go through a lot of trials. We've seen through him deal with a lot of difficulty. And yet, this is the first mention of him weeping or crying. You know, Abraham had gone through a lot of disappointment in life. He was disappointed when his nephew, who he most likely thought of as a son, speaking of Lot, Abraham's brother, Lot's father, died, and Abraham took him in, and cared for him and prayed for him and helped him out. He was disappointed when that nephew ended up leaving him and going elsewhere. We've already talked about how he was most likely heartbroken when Ishmael was sent away, to the point of not even giving Ishmael and Hagar enough food for the journey as they're going through the desert. He just gave them enough for a few days, most likely in hopes that they might come back. And even in that next chapter, it speaks of Isaac being his only son. I mean, Abraham lost a son in the midst of this. He was in anguish when he had to sacrifice Isaac. You know, I know that he trusted the Lord through that, and he believed, according to Hebrews, that God was going to raise him back from the dead. But for that to happen, Abraham literally would have had to kill his child. Certainly, there was much grief in the years of their barrenness, decades upon decades, not just grief over not having to have a child, but in that time period, that brought shame upon a man and a woman to not be able to have children. And so certainly there was mourning and weeping in that time period. And then the Lord gives him his promise. And then they have to wait years upon years. They have to wait decades for that promise to be fulfilled. And even throughout all of this, this is the first record of Abraham weeping. There may have been some emotions in some of that, but the first time of him weeping. The mourning and weeping was understood in many ways to be norms in that culture. As you read the Bible, both Old and New, it probably also included tearing his clothes and shaving his head, as we see from Job in Job chapter 1, as he hears about the death of his children, and he tore his clothes, shaved his head, and he sat in ashes and sackcloth. That was common. That was the way they experienced grief. You think about David, as David was grieving the death of his child, and both the child that was born to Bathsheba and also Absalom, when he found out about them dying, he was crying so loudly that people could hear him outside of the temple. And so in that time period, they did show grief more externally than maybe we do now. But Abraham's show of emotion here, I believe, is a sign that Abraham truly loved his wife, and it revealed the depths of his grief and his love for her. And then his actions in finding a proper burial for her, and honestly paying a lot of money for it, should not be surprising to see him honor her in this way. It's interesting to see, in light of everything that they'd been through, the love that the two of them had for each other. Even as the difficulties in life, such as decades of barrenness, and then even the 2 times he abandoned his wife into the harem of a foreign king. Here, as they get to the end of that journey together, it shows that though difficult times may come about within the life of a marriage, that we can persevere and we can grow in love both towards God and towards one another. And so, whatever those difficulties may be, whatever those trials may be, even when those might be grievous sin, such as Abraham, again, abandoning his wife into a harem of a foreign king just to protect himself. Or in modern terms, it could be other grievous sin on behalf of one to the other. Regardless of what we face in marriage, regardless of what difficulty we go through, regardless of what adversity that we may face, God is a God of reconciliation. God is in the business of overcoming sin, and God is in the business of making all people new. And God can reconcile a couple even through sin. Isaiah chapter 40 says that God is the God who will help us, who will strengthen us, and who will uphold us with his righteous right hand. Even if it's not sin, if it's just general adversity that we face in life, painful circumstances in life don't have to make us put up walls, which so often it does. We end up responding towards situations in life with bitterness and hardness. We see many people just losing emotion altogether after going through such difficulty in life. And now, because I've been scarred from these other things, now it's affecting my relationship with my spouse. And the more difficulty I face, the more emotional things get, the more it begins to affect my relationship with those around me, and in particular, my spouse. Abraham and Sarah had been through a ton, and yet there was love and commitment even then. Painful circumstances and adversity don't have to make us put up walls, but rather they can bring us closer together. I'm reminded of passages like Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. Whenever we go through these difficulties, we always need to consider, what role does God play in all of this? We even look to the book of Job. Satan was the one instigating all of it, but God had a role in it too. Satan had to go to God and ask God permission for those things, to be able to do those things. And God even put parameters on what Satan could do to Job and what he couldn't. And so we look at passages like Ephesians 1:11. It says, in him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. Who works all things according to the counsel of his will. What role does God play in the adversity that you're facing? Ecclesiastes 7:11. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other. I've been working with a couple, not from our church, from elsewhere, helping out their pastors, dealing with a situation to where there was grievous sin on behalf of the husband towards the wife. The wife is not happy that it happened, wish that it didn't. But in the midst of it, and this is stuff that she started to put together, even without my help, that she brought up to me, is that there had been issues of pride in her husband for a long time that had been sucking the joy in life from that marriage. And it was this husband finally falling into this sin and committing this sin that finally broke him and humbled him and brought the humility that she had been praying for years. Now, she readily admits, I wish he would have brought the humility a different way. But the Lord brought it. And as a result, it was painful what they went through. It's still painful, but their marriage is growing and getting better than it had been in years. But it took pain to break him. And it may not always be that specific purpose, but when we look at the promises of the Bible, God works all things according to the counsel of his will. Romans 8:28, and we know, it's not I think, but we know that for those who love God, he works all things for good according to his purpose. And we know. That's a truth. That's a promise we can cling to. God is working in all aspects, the prosperity and the adversity. And so as we're going through these difficult things in life, these trials, these afflictions, they don't have to make us put up walls. They can draw us closer to the Lord and draw us closer to each other in marriage, to where we can say, along with Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, for when I am weak, then I'm strong. Why? Because my weakness draws me to the Lord and forces me to be dependent on him. Those who love God, fear him, and are willing to keep their marriage vows and love their spouses through the good times and bad, the fun and the painful. They trust the Lord and keep their marriage as a sign of faithfulness to the Lord. When they stumble, they repent and endeavor to rejoice in the spouse of their youth. And we see that for Abraham and Sarah. Tons of difficulty, yet at the end of the life, there's still joy. Secondly, in the story of Sarah's death, we see Abraham's trust in the Father. In the story of Sarah's death, we find Abraham's trust in the Father. Sarah's death was another temptation for Abraham to doubt God and to turn away from him. Again, we just talked about it, everything you went through in life, and here's something else. Death in general is hard. We've seen how emotional he was, how hard it was for him. There could have been a temptation to be bitter and angry. We finally have the life that we've wanted. We finally got children. He's to the point of getting married, and soon we're going to have grandchildren. Remember, God had promised you're not just going to have a child, you're going to be the father of many nations. So far, all they'd seen was one child. God, the life is just now getting good. And she dies? There's a temptation there to grow bitter, to get upset, especially considering, again, that Sarah never actually saw God's promises fully fulfilled. Again, she had a child. That's kind of a big promise, right? That was fulfilled. But she didn't see it fully fulfilled. But instead of growing bitter, Abraham chose to trust God instead. And his choice of where to bury her is a sign of that. Let me explain. It was customary in that time period for families to bury their dead in their ancestral lands. If Abraham would have done that, what was customary, he would have returned to his native land in the land of Ur, but he doesn't. He buries her in the land of Canaan. Why would he do that? Because his land was no longer Ur. His land was now the land that God promised him, the land from which would flow the many nations that would come from him, Canaan. And so Abraham was walking by faith and not by sight. God had not even given him the land. Yes, he was living there, but he was still in many ways just a traveler. But he's walking by faith and not by sight. God had promised him to be the father of many nations stationed in the promised land of Canaan. And so his buying of the burial plot in Canaan was a sign of trusting God. He bought the burial plot because he trusted that the Lord was going to keep his promise. Again, only a small aspect of that promise had been fulfilled over the course of decades at this point. A small portion. And yet Abraham said, I believe this is where my family is going to be. The Lord has promised it. The Lord has said it. We will be here, and so I'm burying my wife here. In fact, the burial spot was not far from where they first heard the promise that she would give birth to Isaac. And as one commentator said, their bones bore witness to future generations of the promise that God gave. Their bones bore witness to future generations of the promise that God gave. God said, this will be your land. It wasn't even their land yet, but he bought it to bury them in there. The price of 400 shekels of silver was honestly probably price gouging, because later on in 2 Samuel and Jeremiah, we find land in the same area bought for incredibly cheaper. But he does it anyways because he knows the land is rightfully his. Abraham trusts the Father. The land was actually the first property that he ever owned while in Canaan. So that's something interesting. We see God working in all things. It was through the death of his wife that the first piece of property actually was provided for him. That was the first piece that he owned. And God, through the death of Sarah, begins to give him that promised land. The death of his wife began that process of bringing about God's fulfilled promises to him. Again, God has his good purposes in all things, and we can trust him, even in the painful times, such as the death of a spouse. When we face the death of a loved one, we can face it with hope that God will uphold our hope in his promises. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, one of the most common verses that we pastors use at funerals. It's one that I nearly always use out at the gravesite. Paul writes, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." It's interesting there. He doesn't say, don't grieve. He's expecting grief to come. Somebody you love died. Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Jesus wept. If Jesus was an infinitely righteous man and Jesus grieved, Jesus had sorrow, and Jesus wept, that means grief and sorrow and weeping are also righteous responses. The issue with Jesus is that grief and sorrow never overtook him and became despair. Jesus had hope and joy and peace even in the midst of grief and sorrow and weeping. And Paul tells us that we can too, is that when we grieve not as those who have no hope. It is okay to grieve, but that grief should never define us. Abraham grieved, but grief did not define Abraham. He grieved, but he kept trusting God. And not only did he keep trusting God, but he kept acting on that trust. So often our grief, when it turns into despair, it immobilizes us. We can't do anything, can't get out of bed, can't go anywhere, can't accomplish anything. But Abraham, in his weeping, continued to trust God and then kept acting on that trust. I'm reminded of what I mentioned in my sermon Sunday from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, to where Paul said, we are persecuted but not forsaken. I realize Abraham wasn't necessarily persecuted, but in the midst of death, Abraham knew that God had not forsaken him. If anything, he trusted God all the more by going and buying a plot of land in the land that God had promised him. Difficulty and hardship and pain does not mean that we are forsaken. God is good in all things. The day of prosperity and the day of adversity, he has made the one as well as the other. And so as we look at how Abraham dealt with the death of Sarah, we can look to his grief as a model for how to persevere in difficult circumstances. Third, moving the focus now to Sarah, we see that Sarah trusted the Lord even in death. We see that Sarah trusted the Lord even in death. Now, the story of Genesis doesn't tell us a lot about this, but the Old Testament does. As we look to the New Testament, I should say, as we look to the New Testament, we are never told to look to Mary, and we are never told to honor Mary. Catholics, of course, do that. They've essentially deified Mary. But we are never told to look to Mary as an example of a godly woman. Not saying that she wasn't. She was, clearly, but we were just never commanded to look to her. Whereas Sarah, there are 3 different times in the New Testament to where we are commanded to follow her example. The first one being in 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3. Verses 1 and 2 are about wives submitting to their own husbands. Then in verse 3, he says, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear. That doesn't mean you can't braid your hair or wear jewelry. That's just saying that shouldn't be your focus. You may say, hold on, Pastor, that's what it says. But it also says, don't let your adorning be the clothing you wear. So if you hold to the argument, you can't braid your hair, wear jewelry, you also hold the argument that all of you women are wearing clothes are sinful, right? So if you're going to apply it to 2, you got to apply it to 3. So he's not saying don't wear clothes, clearly. Thus, we can apply that to the other 2. He's not saying don't braid your hair and don't wear gold jewelry. He's saying don't let that be your focus. Rather, verse 4, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. He's saying that women, if there's something in life that they're seeking, that they should be seeking to become beautiful inwardly, infinitely more than they're seeking to be beautiful outwardly. Seeking to have no blemish or spot or wrinkle, which is the words Peter uses in 1 Peter 1. Seeking to have no blemish or spot or wrinkle inwardly should be more important to you than seeking to have no blemish, spot, or wrinkle outwardly. Right? That's the point he's making. And then in verse 5, he says, "For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening." Sarah is upheld as an example for women today. We see Isaiah chapter 51. Isaiah chapter 51, verses 1 through 2. Isaiah 51, 1 through 2. "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you are hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you. For he was but one when I called him, that I might bless him and multiply him." Again, Sarah is held out before us as someone that we should emulate and that we should follow. Now, the big one's going to be Hebrews 11, but I want us to turn to Philippians 1 before we get there. Philippians 1 is going to kind of set the stage for Hebrews 11. Philippians 1, verses 19 and 20. "Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance." Now, what's he talking about there? Paul was essentially on death row. He had been in jail for going on 5 years now. First in Caesarea, 2 years there. He couldn't get a hearing. They were just going to let him languish there for political reasons. But him being a Roman citizen, he could appeal to Caesar for a hearing before Caesar. He appeals to Caesar, who's Emperor Nero at the time. Really big gamble there for Paul. But to get there, they didn't have airplane. He had to take a ship. He was on that ship as a prisoner for a year, even to the point, Acts 27 records a shipwreck. They decided to sail during winter. Paul said, it's not a good idea. You shouldn't do it. They do it anyways. The ship crashes in the water in the middle of winter. And so it took him a year to get to Rome. Now he's been in Rome for 2 years. About 5 years, Paul's been in jail. And he's awaiting this trial before Nero. And Nero, who hates Christians, one of the most wicked men ever, could release him and declare him innocent, or could chop off his head and kill him right there. And Paul understands that. So as he's writing about this in verse 19, "I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance." So some may say, well, okay, so he knows that I'm, going to be released and I'm going to be innocent. Not necessarily. Look at verse 20. "As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored," or other translations say magnified, "in my body, whether by life or by death." He holds both up as an option, living or dying. But either one, whether it was life or death, Paul referred to it as a deliverance. Deliverance from what? This world. And the pain and the sorrow and the heartache. Even if he had his head chopped off, that was an answer to prayer. But Paul's greatest prayer in the midst of that wasn't, "God, get me out of jail." Paul's greatest prayer in the midst of it was that Christ would be magnified in his body, whether by life or by death. If I live, I want to have full courage that I would magnify Christ. What does that mean? We think about what John the Baptist said, that I must decrease so he might increase. I live a life to make Christ appear more glorious to those around me. I want to magnify Christ above myself. I want to decrease, rather, I want to magnify Christ. So I want to have full courage. If I'm going to live, Christ is magnified. Christ is who they see. Likewise, if my head is chopped off, I want to be just as courageous to magnify Christ in how I die. I want Christ to be honored regardless of what happens in my life. In light of that, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, keeping that in mind for Sarah. Hebrews 11 through 13. Hebrews 11 through 13. Said, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, verse 13, this summarizes some, not only Sarah, but others that had been mentioned, said, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Sarah died even though God's promise had not yet been fulfilled. It said that Sarah died trusting him. Even in death, even if I die, God's still going to fulfill the promise. Even in death, I'm going to be faithful and I'm not going to magnify the Lord. Me dying before this promise is fully fulfilled does not change the faithfulness and the promises of God. She considered him faithful who had promised, and she died in faith, though she had not yet received the things promised, but only seeing them from afar. As we're facing difficulties in life, do we face them with faith? As we are facing our own death, look, it's coming for all of us. It's been appointed, unless the Lord returns before that. It's been appointed. You know, we don't like to talk about death. They passed away, right? They died. I'm not trying to make light of that. Death is coming. We don't even like to say the word, well, so-and-so passed away. They died. Death is coming for all of us. Whether it's us, whether it's our loved ones, will we look to Sarah? As we are told in Isaiah 51, as we're told in 1 Peter 3, will we look to one of the women who hoped in God? And will we die in faith, magnifying the Lord with how we trusted him and how we stayed faithful through that? When a spouse dies, when a child dies, look, again, I'm not telling you not to grieve. Grieve, but in the midst of that grief, will we face it with faith? Will we face it trusting the promises of God? Will we walk by faith, not by sight? I don't see how this is going to work out. I don't see God's promise being fulfilled. It doesn't matter if you see it. What matters is if you said it and if you trust him. And so she knew, and Abraham knew, 2 Corinthians 5, 6 through 9. And so we are always of good courage, for we know that to be present in the body is to be away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. She understood that. As long as we're in these bodies, we're away from the Lord, but to leave, and Paul understood it, to leave the body, we're going to be with the Lord. And so he finishes in chapter 5, verse 9, so whether at home or away, whether at home in the body or away from the body with the Lord, we make it our aim to please Christ. Or as he said in Philippians 1:21, whether in life or death, I make it my aim to magnify Christ in my body. So a very quick chapter. That's easy to just glance through, but we see Abraham and Sarah magnifying the Lord and trusting the Lord even in the midst of death. And I pray that we can as well. For those of you who joined us at home, we thank you for doing that. And we're going to move now into our time of prayer. So if you have your prayer list, y'all can turn there with me.